chapter 21, verses 20 to 22. Pretty lengthy. Just prior to this reading, Peter had been, I suppose, reinstated. If you recall, when Jesus was arrested, he denied Jesus 3 times before the cock crowed. But here he's been recalled, I suppose. And Jesus has been talking to him, and now Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" That's John, of course. When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Short and sweet and direct to the point. I've headed this up, the call of Jesus. The call to follow Jesus can come to anybody. There can be a call to follow him and become a Christian. If you're a Christian, it can be a call to come and do something special in particular. Or it can be a call to come and be a Christian and do something in particular. Any mix and match of that sort of thing. It can come at any time in our lives. And I think I have to say that I don't think any of us is really prepared for what it will involve, or how it will change our lives. The ideal, of course, if we accept the call, would be for life to be a bed of roses thereafter. However, the reality is often totally different. Over the years, I've spoken to a number of people, and not one has shared that their life suddenly became easy the moment they answered the call to Jesus. In fact, their lives contain challenges, although they've got the challenges that everyone in the world faces, and a few others beside, that come as a result of their answering the call. One big change that seems to be common was that their life and that of their family was no longer their own. On the other hand, following Jesus does have its compensations. He's always present on the journey he sets you off on, giving guidance, and we can lean on him in times of trouble. In fact, in Matthew 11, verses 28 to 30, he tells us to do just that, to cast our burdens upon him. In contrast, those who decide instead to answer the call of the world, that sinful place in which we live but aren't part of, they will have no great friend by their side, and no one to meet them at the end of life and usher them into that glorious eternity promised by Jesus. In our text, Jesus is at the end of his time on earth, and having restored Peter in the previous section, here we see him giving Peter instructions for his life. In response, in effect, he says, "Well, what's John going to do?" And Jesus replies, "What's that got to do with you? You must follow me." And that's what he says to all of us. It doesn't matter what others say to us or what they do, we are to follow Jesus. Others may criticize, others may fall by the wayside, and others may question our motives. But We are to follow Jesus and obey his commands. Now the world is full of different sorts of calls. There's the call to make a lot of money. How often do we hear that? The call to serve our country, in the armed forces or otherwise. And of course there's the call to have a good time. There's the call of Jesus, and there's the call of the world. And a choice has to be made. And I would recommend unequivocally the call of Jesus. But the question is, what does that really involve? So let's have a look at some possible answers to that question. Jesus calls us to leave all sin. Now I read somewhere about an archaeologist. Is that the right word? Yeah. In an archaeological dig in ancient Babylon. And it found that each brick had the king's imprint on it. But one of them had the paw print of a dog partially covering the king's mark. I guess he must have walked across the brick before it was fully hardened. But it left his imprint there. In the same way, God places his mark upon all his children, all those who follow him. But that mark can often be marred by our sin, in this way that the dog's paw print marred the king's sin. We want to see Jesus in us, but sadly, that's sometimes prevented by our sin. Only our sin is visible. Now, most Christians are not guilty of gross, open sin. But Jesus warns us about the sins of the spirit, sins of a bad disposition or a bad attitude. I know that I fall foul of this. So the question is, am I alone? Is it just me? These sins are not always visible to the naked eye, but sometimes they're just as hurtful than the other sins. I'd like to just turn to Proverbs. So not we go there, do we? Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 to 19. And if you want, you'll find it on page 449 in the Blue Bible. Starting verse 16. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. That's a total of 7 that are counted. Haughty eyes, that's a proud outlook. A lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. A heart that devises wicked schemes. Feet that are quick to rush into evil. A false witness who pours out lies. And a person who stirs up conflict in the community. I think that describes people we don't really want to be associated with, or more importantly, don't want to be. It's not difficult to see how these translate into sins that can cause real problems for others, particularly the last one, which has been the cause of splits in various churches over the years. Some people just love to stir up problems and cause division. Sin of any kind is displeasing to God. Every sin is a slap in the Saviour's face, crucifying him again. God calls us to get rid of every sin from our lives. That's a pretty tall order, but we have to try. Jesus calls us to serve him better. Now, Peter had served Jesus since he was first called. But when the testing time came, he failed him. if you recall the cock crowing. But now Jesus recalls him. And in verse 22 he says, "Follow me." After this, Peter's life is totally different. The rest of his life is spent serving Christ. How do you fit into this? How do I fit into this? Do we need to be recalled? Sometimes I think I do. And Jesus calls us into a deeper prayer life. How deep is our prayer life? Some people never pray. Others pray now and then when they get into trouble. Some folk are so busy that they offer only a sentence or two each day. But some live so close to God and talk to him often, as a friend. I have to confess that I probably fall somewhere in the middle of that. I'm certainly not what one might call a prayer warrior. When I think of three lovely old ladies at a previous church, I feel pretty guilty. Because they were prayer warriors, and they certainly put me to shame. Most of us know what it is to carry a burden, laying awake at night, worrying about the latest crisis in our lives. As I mentioned in Matthew 11, Jesus tells us that those who are burdened should go to him, and he will give them rest. This we can do through prayer. But there's a more difficult type of prayer. Jesus calls us to pray for those who treat us badly. This is difficult, but my experience tells me that we also will benefit from such a prayer. As such prayers will remove hatred from our hearts. Hatred does nobody any good, least of all the one doing the hating. I know this from personal experience. Many years ago, a young man grievously hurt our family. And I carried a hatred for this young man for must be 7 years or more. But after a sermon on the unforgiving servant at the Keswick Convention, I was able to finally forgive him. He didn't know. By that time I didn't know who he was, but this hatred had still been burning. I finally forgave him, and immediately a great weight was lifted off my shoulders. Felt as though I was walking on air. We all have many problems in life, and we can't deal with them on our own. Take them to the Lord in prayer. Jesus then calls us also to read the Bible more. This raises the question, how can we live our lives as Jesus will have us live them if we don't know what he wants us to live? The only way we can really discover that is by reading the Bible. Once we become familiar with that, we can start to apply its teachings to our own lives. It may be that many people don't read the Bible because it highlights the shortcomings in their lives. But is this a bad thing? If we don't know about these shortcomings, how can we rectify them? So how does this work in practice? How do we know we're being called? I can only answer that by telling you the short version of what happened to me many years ago. certainly over 20, probably nearer 30. I hope Sally will forgive me, but we started courting when she was 15 and I was 16, still at school. Although I was sent to Sunday school as a child, my family wasn't involved with the church in any way, and I couldn't possibly describe myself as a Christian. I learned later that although Sally's family was similar to mine, Sally had taken herself to church and she became a believer. But our courtship caused a break in that. I learned about that later. I may or may not mention how. After we married and had 3 children, Sally took them to church, but I didn't go. And many years later, Sally was the matron of a large nursing, care and supported housing complex. And she became involved with a lady at head office who, with her husband, had started a charity taking humanitarian aid and Christian mission to a very poor area in northeastern Romania, working with a Baptist minister and his church in that town. This was immediately after the removal and execution of Nikolai and Elena Ceausescu at the end of 1989. Strangely enough, I helped them with the fundraising, sorting and boxing up the aid donations, and loading the lorry that was to take it all to Romania, which happened in each May, when members of the charity would travel out at their own expense, arrive at Bucharest, do a 200-mile journey across the mountains, and carry work under the direction of the pastor at the church and distribute the aid. And as that first May arrived, Sally asked me if I'd go with them. And I simply replied, no. She asked me why. And I couldn't even give a sensible answer. However, she went and I stayed at home. The next year came and the same happened. I still couldn't give a sensible answer to her why. And off she went, and I stayed at home. Then the 3rd year came, and I had an inexplicable and overwhelming desire. I wanted to go with them. Don't ask me why, because I didn't know. I then had the difficulty of broaching this issue with Sally. And after weeks of anguish, and believe me, it was anguish, I finally plucked up the courage to tell her that I wanted to go with them to Romania. Guess what she said? Why? Still, I couldn't give a sensible answer. I just had this overwhelming desire to go, and she undertook to talk to the others to see if I could go. And come May, I was on a plane on the way to Romania. To cut a long story short, within a couple of days of being involved with the other members of the charity and that church out there, I mean, this was a little church where on a Sunday morning, people outside who couldn't get in would be hanging in through the windows. It was full of spirit. But after a couple of days, I was resting on a bench, laying down, half dozing, and I met with the Lord. And a few months later, I was baptised. I don't know how it happened, but I guess I received a call. And we spent the next 10 years spending most of the year raising funds, collecting the aid, and travelling to our friends in the Romanian church, where we would help them distribute the aid. And we ended up speaking in countless associated churches, giving them encouragement in their newfound freedom to worship as Baptists without the fear of being betrayed and carted off by the secret police. That's where I did my first speaking in churches, 10 years in Romania. How do we come to this? How did it happen? Well, I'm convinced it had to be a call of Jesus, with hindsight. I knew nothing about that. It just happened. I may have resisted him for 3 years, but he didn't give up on me. The Lord is faithful, as we just sung, and he helped me overcome the shock of having to stand up in front of many churches whose language I didn't speak, as did the others. The call of Jesus can come at any time, often most unexpectedly.